Hello and welcome to today's video. Today I've chosen an article which talks about India and its successful launch of its first mission to the Sun. This comes on the back of a previous mission which was launched recently to the South Pole of the Moon. As usual, we're going to go through it paragraph by paragraph, and you can read it through with me, or you can download the text, which is in the video description underneath. So let's start with the first paragraph. India has successfully launched its first observation mission to the Sun, just days after the country made history by becoming the first to land near the Moon's south pole. Aditya L1 lifted off from the launch pad on Saturday at 11:50 India time. The Indian Space Research Agency, ISRO, has not said how much the mission would cost, but reports in the Indian press put it at 3.78 billion rupees, which is approximately $46 million or 36 million pounds sterling. So, as usual, we're going to look at some of the interesting words in this article. First off, let's have a look at this adverb up here, successfully. Now, if you do something successfully, it basically means that you have achieved an objective, something that you were aiming to do. You've managed to do it. There's a couple of other forms of this. We can also talk about the abstract noun success. And a person who achieves their objectives is often described as a successful person. So, let's move on to the second phrase here. Now, this is a phrase made up of two words, the verb make and the noun history. If you make history, basically that means you have done something special, something that is worthy of admiration, something that perhaps will change the course of human history and development. A couple of examples of this could be, for example, when NASA first landed on the moon. That made history because it had never been done before. Another one from technology could be with the invention of the telephone. The first phone call that was made, which was, I think I've got it somewhere here, in 1876 by Alexander Graham Bell. This also made history because nobody had ever used a telephone before. So there's a couple of examples of events that have made history. Of course, there's many other examples that you could think of. In this case, India made history because it was the first to land near the moon's south pole. That had never been attempted. Well, it never happened before successfully. In fact, I think Russia had attempted it a couple of weeks before. So the third word or phrase we have here is liftoff. This is actually a phrasal verb, and it's actually quite similar in meaning to take off. When we talk about airplanes taking off, we know that they are leaving the land. And equally, if a rocket or a spaceship lifts off, also it leaves the Earth and goes into space. We can see in the picture over here, a rocket is lifting off. And in fact, you often hear at the end of the countdown, the person who is doing the countdown will say, "We have liftoff." This is a phrasal verb which is composed of two elements. The first is a verb, and generally speaking, lift is when you elevate something. So it has similar meaning to the phrasal verb, just slightly different usage. And of course, lift can also be a synonym of elevator. In Britain, we call an elevator a lift because obviously it lifts people and objects from the bottom floor to the top floor. Okay, so let's move on to the next paragraph. Aditya L1 is a 400-kilo spacecraft that carries 7 scientific payloads, including a coronagraph, a solar ultraviolet imaging telescope, and a solar wind particle experiment. The spacecraft will travel 1.5 million kilometers from the Earth and be placed at a Lagrange point, a spot where the gravitational forces of two large objects, such as the Sun and the Earth, cancel each other out, allowing a spacecraft to hover. It will take 4 months to reach its destination. Okay, so we have this word up here, payload. This is a word that is most closely associated with aircraft or spacecraft. And basically it refers to everything that is carried by a aircraft or a spacecraft. So the payload in this case is all of the scientific equipment that is being carried inside the ship. Let's move on to the next word we have highlighted here, spot. This is a noun, and spot is basically a place or point. So if we talk about tourist spots, the top tourist spots in a city, these would be the places where most tourists would like to visit or where they usually go. Spot also has another use. It can be, for example, a blemish on somebody's skin. Teenagers often develop spots on their skin. It's, again, we're talking about a small point. But in this case, the spot we're talking about is a place between the Earth. We can see illustrated here on the image between the Earth and the Sun. It's this green point right here. We see that this spot or point is closer to the Earth than the Sun. Obviously, the Sun, being a much more massive object, has a much greater gravitational pull. Therefore, the spot where those two gravitational forces are the same is much closer to the Earth. So that brings us on to the next word we have here, which is a phrasal verb, to cancel out. And this phrasal verb basically means that two opposing forces are having the same effect on an object, and their combined effect is 0. So in this case, because the gravitational forces of the Earth and the Sun at this point are equal, or acting equally on the spacecraft, there's no overall effect. They cancel each other out. A good example of this, or another example which you may be familiar with, is noise cancelling earphones. A lot of us use earphones or earpods these days to listen to music, and a lot of modern ones have this noise cancelling feature. So what it does, the earphones actually use technology to cancel out the noise that is surrounding you. So the final word we have in this paragraph is hover. Hover. This is a verb, to hover. It's actually a regular verb. Hovered would be the past. And probably the most familiar sense of this would be if we think of a helicopter, for example. Helicopters have the ability to hover, whereas most aircraft have to be constantly moving. A helicopter can be static. It can stay in the same place. That's what hover means. Basically, it means to be able to be suspended in space without movement in any direction. Now, in this case, in the article, it's the spacecraft that is hovering. It is staying static in the same place between the Earth and the Sun. Okay, so let's move on to the next paragraph. I'll read it through. Aditya L1 will observe and study the solar corona, the outermost layer, the photosphere, the sun's surface, or the part we see from the Earth, and the chromosphere, a thin layer of plasma that lies between the photosphere and the corona. The studies will help scientists understand solar activity, such as solar wind and solar flares, and the impact of solar activity on the Earth's climate and communication systems. So we have two words highlighted here. The first one is layer. A layer is a noun, and basically it is a substance or material that covers something else. A good way of thinking about a layer is, if you like cooking and you're familiar with a popular dish which is called lasagna, which comes from Italy originally, this dish is composed of different layers. First, you might put a layer of meat and tomato sauce. Then you might put another layer of pasta that covers that. and you may put another further layer of meat and then more white sauce or bechamel, and you build up the lasagna by putting layer on top of layer. A further example could be from geology. If you look at rocks, if you dig under the ground, you will see that there are different layers of geology there. And in fact, geologists and even archaeologists can use these different layers to date the finds, the things that they find buried under the earth, and also to make deductions about climate and other things like that. Okay, so let's move on to the final word here we have in this paragraph, and this word is flare. This is a noun, and it's actually used in combination with solar here, solar flare. Probably a good example of a flare would be an emergency flare. So sometimes if people are in a dangerous situation, for example, if they're at sea and they have some kind of problem, maybe their boat breaks down and they need to be rescued, they can signal that they're in distress by launching a flare into the air. So this is a device that looks a little bit like a gun, and when you fire it, a jet comes out and flies into the air, a bit like a big pyrotechnic, and it explodes or it lights up. So this sends a signal to the emergency services to come and rescue you. Now, when we're talking about a solar flare, it's kind of similar in that there is an ejection of material in a similar way. But in this case, it's the sun that is ejecting that material. A solar flare can eject material into space, and if this actually comes near the Earth, it can cause a lot of problems. It can interact with the Earth's geomagnetic field and disrupt communications and even impact the weather. So this is one of the reasons why this kind of study is very important, so that we can understand these flares and predict them. So let's move on to the last paragraph for today. The mission is expected to contribute to the global efforts of solar physics research and pave the way for future solar missions. Aditya L1 is a milestone for India's space program, as it is the first dedicated solar mission of the country and the first Indian spacecraft to be inserted in an orbit around L1. So we only have one phrase that I've highlighted here, and this is the phrase pave the way. To pave the way. Now, basically, this is a phrase that is used to indicate that we are making preparations or doing some work that in the future will make it a little easier or more possible to do something else. Now, in Britain, when we walk in the street, usually we have the road, which is for the cars, and next to the road we have something called the pavement. Obviously, that word is related to pave, because to pave basically means to put a surface, a hard surface, on a road or path in order to make it easier to walk across. So if you imagine many years ago, the roads that we had, the roads that existed, were very primitive. They were very muddy and very full of rocks. Then gradually over time, those paths became paved. We put stones in order to make a flat surface, to make it easier for vehicles to pass across them. So this phrase really is kind of metaphor, because if you're paving the way for something, as we said before, you're making preparations. So you're paving the path in order to make it easier in the future for people to walk down that path. So that's essentially what they're doing here. This research is going to make it easier in the future for solar missions that may happen at a later date. Okay, so I think that's enough for today. Thank you for listening and watching. And don't forget, if you want to read the text file, you can find it in the description below the video. Thank you very much. And don't forget to like and subscribe.